Hello and welcome to MalMakes. Today we're doing a still life painting based on Animal Crossing New Horizons. This is the full version. If you're interested in the time lapse, you can click on the card here. Otherwise, let's get started. Before I talk about my actual painting, I want to talk about why I toned this canvas and how I did it, just so you know that ahead of time. First off, I did this ahead of time because I needed it to dry, and it takes a while compared to my regular paints. I did use all of my regular paints and media for this, just because I use such a thin texture for the paint. It takes a little bit. I checked it at 24 hours and it still was a little bit tacky, so I let it go another 24 hours, so 48 total, so I could start to work on it. And I wanted it to be ready to go for my video so I could start painting right away. Otherwise, I would have had to introduce this video, tone the canvas in the video, let it dry for 2 days, and then start filming again. So I did this ahead of time, so I could work on some other things. So the reasons people would tone a canvas, there's three I think are kind of the main reasons someone would tone a canvas. The first one is to influence the final color of the piece. I'm going very traditional, so I've picked a very traditional tone for my canvas, and you would do kind of like a warm or a cool tone based on whatever your final painting was going to be, and I'm going to have kind of more of a traditional warm still life, so that's why I've gone with this kind of brown tea color. If you were doing something like nighttime or snow or like underwater or something with a lot of blue, you may go in the opposite route and go with more of an ultramarine blue underpainting tone for your canvas. Some people, like the people who are doing a bit more pop art or like to have that kind of pop of bright color somehow, they may go with something a bit more vibrant, like a bright green or a bright red, and that's kind of based on your style and what you find you like. So you can play around with these colors. You don't have to stick with kind of this burnt sienna color or an ultramarine blue and that's it. You can do anything. It's really up to you and how you like how it changes your colors in the end. But like I said, I went with this because I'm going traditional and I want mine to be a bit warmer at the end, so I'm starting with a warmer brown color. The second reason someone would tone a canvas is to kind of prevent some like mechanical issues from happening. I notice that when I paint on a brand new canvas, sometimes I get these little pinpricks where an air pocket has gotten trapped under my paint, and as it dries it pops, and then I see like these tiny little white dots everywhere that are canvas showing through. Now over time I've learned how to kind of prevent that from happening as I'm painting, but it still happens and it's frustrating to me because I'm a bit of a perfectionist with things, and even these tiny little pinpricks everywhere of white bother me. So if you do this tone, it's kind of filling in all of those areas where air would get trapped with this toning, so it happens less. And the last reason someone would tone a canvas, I think, is to make it less intimidating. When you start with a brand new, blank, perfect canvas, it's kind of hard to start. You don't want to ruin it and you don't want to muddy it up and start wrong. So if you start with a toned canvas, that first step, that really hard first step of starting your painting is done. I've dirtied this up, it's ready to go. I don't have to worry about ruining it because I've already done the first step. So that's one of the reasons that I think a lot of people tone canvases, and I like that idea. So I feel like I might be doing that more, you know, in the coming paintings because I like the idea of that, and it definitely helps. It's something I used to do in college and kind of got away from because I like the bright saturation that I use, that I don't get if I'm using this tone here. It kind of tones everything down. So I may do that in some of the coming paintings, but I really like the idea of why that would help someone. Because of the drying time, I still want to demo this so you know exactly how I toned the canvas. I have an 11 by 14 here, and the very first thing I want to do is lightly sand this. I just want to get rid of some of the bigger bumps here on the canvas. And I won't be able to visually see a difference, but I can definitely feel it with my fingertips. So if I just lightly sand across it, I should be able to tell like where it's going to be rough yet and I still need to sand. Now, sanding does create some dust, and I don't think it's going to cause a whole lot of problems in your painting, but just in case, I still like to wipe all of my canvases down with a wet towel, just to get any of that extra dust off the surface. Now my tone, like I said, is very traditional. I'm going a bit warmer. I'm trying to work like some of the more famous still life painters in history, so I want it to be warmer. And that color is here on this little palette that I have, this little paper palette. And I've mixed it up by making a gray and then adding burnt sienna to it. So with my gray, I used bone black and zinc white. And I picked these two because it's a warmer black and they're both very transparent compared to like Mars black and titanium white. You don't have to go out and buy a separate black and white to tone your canvas. You can just use your titanium white and Mars black and just make sure you add more glazing liquid to it to make it more transparent. So I'm just using these two to make a gray and then some burnt sienna to make it a bit more warm. So I end up with something like this on my canvas, or my palette here. And it's still pretty opaque even though I use those transparent whites and blacks to make it grayer. So I'm going to mix a lot of glazing liquid and maybe even some airbrush media into it. I don't want to use water with acrylic because based on your brand or even the color sometimes, the binder can get kind of stretched too thin, and when you put it on your canvas, if the binder isn't strong enough and it's been watered down with water, it won't adhere and stick really good to your canvas, so it may peel off or flake off. So I like to make sure I'm not adding water at this stage because I don't want that to happen underneath the rest of my painting. I want this first layer to be really cemented to the canvas and then kind of work from there. So I'm using the glazing liquid, I'm using the airbrush media to make sure that it still has enough binder in it to stick here on the canvas. I'm using these two mediums because I like them for different reasons, and I don't want to use just one and not the other because that's just what I found personally works really well. I like the gloss glazing liquid because it makes things very transparent but still binds to the canvas really well. So I use this all the time. I use it for making glazes, watering down for tones, even just to thin paints a little bit so they're not as stiff and they've dried a little bit. The Airbrush Transparent Extender I don't use all that often. I think I got this when I had a gift card or something, and the only reason I like this one is because it's a lot thinner. It's more like water, and this is a bit more like cream. It's a bit thicker. So I'm using this today, but then a little bit of this just to make it a bit thinner and easier to brush on the canvas. You don't have to go out and get the airbrush one. It's just something I have and I like to use because it is so thin, but I would definitely be using the gloss glazing liquid because of what it's capable of compared to this one. Now this is going to be very soupy here on my palette, and I don't want to have a ton of paint in this gloss glazing liquid because I do want this to be transparent. You can kind of see how it looks like there's a film of this color on top of the canvas, not like a solid layer of paint. I want it to be transparent. That's the point of toning it and not just painting it a color. So you can see it's very transparent here. If I take a little bit of the solid paint and paint that over here, you can see how much darker it is compared to with the glazing liquid and the airbrush one. So I'm just going to kind of blend this in and make it more even across my little canvas here. I probably should have moved the bigger canvas first, but it's okay, it's the same color. I only got a little bit on it, and it won't really bother me later. So I'm just filling this in with my brush here, and you'll notice that it makes a lot of brush marks as I'm working, just because of the nature of how this glaze works with the paint and everything. And I don't want it to be super streaky. I'm not worried about it being uneven, like lighter up here and darker down here. That doesn't bother me, and it's not going to really matter in the end because I'm painting over everything anyway, but I don't like these brush marks, so I'm going to be getting rid of them. And it helps if you have a bigger brush and you want it to be a bit softer and not a stiff brush. So now that I have everything filled in, and even though I have all these streak marks here, I'm going to get rid of them. And I kind of do it by making these X's, and it just kind of softens up all of these lines. And I'm not pushing very hard either, just kind of lightly brushing. Just keep going over some of those areas to get rid of all of those brush lines until I'm happy with how it looks. So here's my toned canvas, and I'm just going to let this dry. And like I said, it took me about 48 hours for mine to dry. And I'm going to work on the big one for the video, so this one can just go sit somewhere else. Having done the little one and pointed out that, you know, some areas are going to be darker and you are going to get some brush marks, you can definitely see it here on the big canvas. You can see some of the dark areas and some of the brush marks, and it's okay. This is all getting painted over with my still life or any other painting I would be doing later. It's just here to kind of influence my final color, to prevent those little pinpricks of white canvas from showing through, and also to make it less intimidating to work on. In college, I drew a lot of still lifes. We'd go into class and it would be another still life to draw or continue the one from last class. So I've kind of grown to love it, and I also miss it because I haven't done it in a very long time. I think the last time I did it was when I was still teaching high school, when I had my students do still lifes. So I thought it would be fun to do, and I feel like this is the only time I could really get away with it in a way, to kind of get it still being MalMakes, but also do a bunch of fruit as a still life. So all 5 of the main Animal Crossing fruit are here. I wanted to have the main 5 that you get on your island, and I thought it would be a nice nod to put a produce sticker here on the apple. I'll probably be changing this up a little bit, but I just kind of roughly drew that in. And I'm going to have a very bright light kind of coming from the top right as a spotlight here on all 5 of the fruits. So I want to draw them in roughly on the canvas first to get an idea of where they're going to go, and then we'll start painting. This has been a struggle to get right on the canvas. First I drew it and it was too big, or it wouldn't be centered in any direction. So it was kind of a pain to get right, getting it this big. And I don't struggle with the shapes, I struggle kind of with the placement of it. And I liked my sketch, so after I drew it the first time and it was too big, I had to erase it, and then I went back to my sketch. So I broke up my sketch into 16 boxes, and I did that by splitting it in half, and then in half again, just to make all of these little boxes. And I didn't mark in the full line, I just kind of marked in some of these intersections where these lines would intersect, and I did the same thing on the canvas, and I used those to kind of judge where things would go. So the intersection up here, right here, to split this box out, is right about here on my canvas, and so I could tell that right where that was almost the center of this little part of the pear. So then I would draw that around there, and kind of judge everything based on all of those dots. And I drew it, and it looked fine, but it was still too big, so then I had to erase it and draw it smaller. So it took me a while to get exactly the size that I wanted here, and making sure that it was kind of even this way and it had a good negative space around it. But now that I finally have that, I used a darker chalk pastel to kind of block things in, so you can see my lighter one like right here, and then doing some of these lines to curve across the surface for the contour. But with it done, I can start to add some paint. I'm going to take a medium darker brown, darker than my toning, and start to block in some of these shadows just to get things cemented. And then I want to work on the background first because it's going to be one of the darker areas of the painting. And then once I kind of get that done, as I paint the fruit, I can kind of overlap it a little bit if I need to kind of cover up any empty space I might leave. It's important for me not to lose the lines for all of these fruit. I'm going to be working on the background next, but I didn't want to lose the edge of the orange here or lose any of those other lines that I have drawn, because it's going to be very hard to get them back if I paint over them. And the background's going to be very dark, so I can't lose those lines. So I've blocked things in with kind of base colors, an orange for the orange, a red violet for the cherries, and so on, just to get them there on the canvas. Now I can work on the background and get that all the way done, and then I can go back to working on the fruit. So for the background, everywhere up here is going to be very dark. I want this to have kind of a bright spotlight effect on the fruit, so everywhere around it is going to be dark. And then along here where the fruit is sitting, it's going to be a bit lighter kind of in the areas in the spotlight, but then it's going to fade darker towards the outside bottom corners. So I want to mix up a brown to start with, something a bit more like this burnt umber, something kind of rich and dark, and fill in all of the space back here. And then as I get to where that spotlight is, I'm just going to add a little bit of white, maybe some burnt sienna to kind of warm it up as I get into these spotlight areas. My background color is a mix of Mars Black, burnt umber, and a little bit of burnt sienna, and a little bit of white just to make it slightly gray. And it looked really good when I started to paint it, but I realize now that it's much too dark. It almost looks black when there's so much of it covering the canvas. So I want to lighten that up just to make it a little bit more visible, especially when you kind of compare it to my backdrop over here. They look very similar from what I can see on the camera right now. And it's too dark, I think, so I need to lighten that up. So I've mixed up a new color, and it's almost like a dark melted chocolate color, and I used burnt umber, a little bit of burnt sienna, a little bit of Mars Black, and a little bit of titanium white, but it's mostly the burnt umber, so it's not as much Mars Black as it was. And I have some of these other colors here on my palette to blend in for the spotlight area, because I mixed a little bit more with white to see what would happen, and it turns more gray than I want, not as warm as I need it to be, so I have some more of like these colors to make it slightly warmer. So I'm going to be taking this and starting in the shadows down here this time. I'm going to kind of fill those in with that color using a little bit of Mars Black to make it slightly darker in some areas, and then I'm going to fade into the brightest colors here. And then once I kind of get that part cemented in, I'm going to fade back into the darker colors and then fill in all of the dark colors. I'm going to paint each of these fruits one by one, and I'm going to be starting with the ones in the background first, and then moving my way to the ones in the foreground. So I want to start with the orange, just because I think it's going to be the hardest one, trying to keep it round, and then with the dimpled texture of the orange peel. So I'm starting with the shadow, and I'm going to be using some burnt sienna and cad red hue, just to kind of bring in some of those shadow colors. And I also can go a bit darker with some burnt umber, and then I can go into some cad orange for the actual part of the orange. I'm working fruit by fruit to fill in all of the still life here. I started with the orange and now I'm working on the pear, and the pear needs a little bit of work yet, it's not done. But with each fruit, I'm thinking about the color, the tone of the entire painting, the texture, and the shape. So with the orange, I want it to be warm. I want this entire painting to be warm, so the shadow for each piece is going to kind of have a warmer quality than a cooler quality. So I looked at browns that would have a little bit of a red to them or an orange to them, so they looked warmer. So I was using some burnt umber and burnt sienna for that, and then I started to work into some cad red hue for the shadows, and then I went into a cad orange for kind of the main color, and then into some yellow and white for the highlights. So I put all these colors down and started to work on the orange. Now with a sphere, when it has a single light on it like this, you get a crescent moon shadow, and it kind of gets these rings that get smaller and smaller until you get to the highlight. And if I had painted this smooth and blended all my colors together really nicely, it would be like a perfect ball. It wouldn't look like an orange because an orange has that dimpled texture all over it. So like I painted the shadow and I went to my next lightest color, which was going to be kind of the burnt sienna, maybe mixed with a little bit of the red. And I painted that here next. And then I just tapped it back into the shadow just to give it that dimpled texture, kind of like a pointillism painting. And then I went into the red by itself and then tapped it back, and then into the orange and tapped it back into the shadows. And I kept working that way all the way towards the highlight. And then I just took some of my highlight colors like the yellow and then the white with some yellow, and then just tapped those in to give it those dots for those highlights. So that's how I did the orange. With the pear, it's obviously going to be smoother and it doesn't have that same texture. So I tried to follow the curves as I was painting. Now, I think the pear needs a little bit of work. It's too green. I want it to be a little bit more yellow to warm it up a little bit because it's kind of cool. And I had used some blue for the shadow and I kind of regret that. So I'm going to kind of go back in and bring in some reds here for the shadow because red is going to be the complement of green, tone the intensity down, and also make it a bit warmer. The hardest thing about the peach is kind of the seam that it gets here where the two parts come together, just to make that look natural and not too cartoonish, so I've kind of played around with the lines and the colors and exactly how I've been shading it, and I think I have it pretty good. The last thing I have to do here is kind of lighten up some of the highlight like I have on the apple here, and then on the orange, and then I have to give the peach a fuzz, otherwise it looks more like a nectarine. So after it completely dries, because I've been using a lot of glazes and thin layers, I'm going to kind of take a little bit of titanium white with more glaze to make it even more transparent and just lightly brush it on. Now that fuzz is going to get caught by the light and just kind of be on some of the peach. I don't want to cover the entire thing or it'll look strange. It's only where the light is going to catch it and kind of illuminate all of those little fuzzes. I don't want this peach fuzz to be too bright. I want it to just kind of be slightly tinged the same color as the peach. So I'm using some raw sienna, which is right here, and then some zinc white because it's transparent, and then some glazing liquid to make this color. And I'm just very lightly brushing it on certain parts of the peach. So I'm thinking about the spotlight hitting here and then kind of just getting the edge here and then a little bit on this side, just so it has a little dusty quality so it has that peach fuzz on it. The pear, the apple, and the orange really go well together. They really feel like they're kind of part of a cohesive painting. The peach I'm a little frustrated with. It doesn't feel like it's part of the painting yet. It's not unified here on the canvas. And I have some theories about why that might be. Like, it might be too saturated, or maybe it needs a little bit more browns down in the shadows instead of kind of this black neutral tone I'm getting. It needs some work yet, so I'm stepping away from it because I'm a bit frustrated and I'm working on the cherries. So I've redrawn these to kind of give them more of a natural cherry shape instead of just a circle, and trying to kind of bring some different angles into them. Now I've started to shade them with some alizarin crimson, bringing some of that down here into the deeper part of the shadow. I want to make these more like Bing cherries instead of like a maraschino cherry because I want it to be different than the apple. I have red, red, and red right here in the front, so I have to find some way to make them different than each other. So for the apple, I kind of want a little bit orange right here. The peach has some of this yellow, so it's going to be very different. And then for the cherries, like I said, I'm going towards the Bing cherry, which is a bit more like a violety color or a burgundy, so I'm going to try and keep them more in that color family just so they're different than the apple and they don't look like they're part of the same fruit here on the canvas. I knew the shadows would be wrong when I blocked them in and then blocked in the fruit and then finished off the fruit. I knew they would be wrong because I hadn't actually drawn exactly where the fruit was going to go. It needed to change a little bit as I changed things up, especially with the cherries, to make them fit correctly. So I kept some of these colors on my palette so I can kind of maybe blend some of these colors a little bit nicer and then fix any of the shadows here that I needed to, so it looked like they were actually sitting on the ground instead of floating, which is what this cherry especially was doing before I did that. So now that I finished that up, I took the opportunity to darken some of these colors a little bit just in the shadows. The pear especially was very light, so I just darkened that up a little bit, and I feel like everything over here matches really well. All four of these fruits fit together and they feel like they're part of the same painting. The peach, not so much. It needs some work and I haven't quite discovered what it actually is that I need to do to make that cohesive with the rest of the painting instead of this other thing here on the canvas. So I'm trying a few different things. I think part of it might have to do with how much is in shadow. If you think about how much of the apple is in shadow, how much of the cherry and the orange, it just doesn't have enough shadow compared to everything else. So I'm taking some of my alizarin crimson right now and just trying to blend a little bit more of that shadow onto the peach, like coming up from the back, just to kind of make it a little bit more in shadow there. I think I might play with some of these colors in here, make them a bit more orangish in color, or like a peach color, like a light orange red color. And I think I might try and do some more fuzz on it after all of that dries, just to get that in a few different ways, maybe changing up small things here and there until I'm happy with how the peach looks. And like I said, I'm going to blend a little bit more on the ground because I still have some of those colors. I think like over here it looks nice, and then there's just kind of a few things where there's some harsh lines that I think need to be blended nicely. And otherwise, I just have to put the produce sticker on the apple. So as I'm waiting on some of this to dry and some of the background to dry, I can work on drawing that in and starting to block that in with its solid colors. Adding in the shadows definitely helped make everything sit in the painting, and the changes I've made to the peach made it feel like it's part of the same painting. It feels like it belongs with everything else now. I'm not sure if I want to do more fuzz on the edge of this here to give it that dusty glow. That would make it look more like a peach and less like a nectarine, but I'm leaving it alone for now, and I'm focusing on the produce sticker, which is the last main thing I have to do. So I've drawn in kind of an egg shape. Now in my sketch, I originally drew it as a circle, and I did kind of a different style logo than I'm going to be doing. But thinking about how it would be on an actual apple, it's going to go back in space as it wraps across the surface of the apple. So it's going to kind of get pinched on the part that's furthest back on the apple. So it's foreshortened back that way, so it's an egg shape. I'm going to kind of fill it in with the base green and the base white, and then I'll start to add some shadows in, kind of keeping it the same way as the apple, where it's darker on the left side and then lighter towards the right. The logo is blocked in with green and white. Now I tried to pick kind of a darker green, trying to match kind of the tones of the middle part of the pear here, just to kind of bring that back into the rest of the painting. And now that it's blocked in, I can kind of like age the sticker because it doesn't look like it matches the rest of the fruit. So it needs to kind of be darker on the bottom side here, and the green probably needs to get some of these yellows into it just to make it match a little bit, and the white is obviously way too bright, so I'm going to tone that down, maybe with some of the peach colors, or maybe into some of these yellows I have here on the apple, just so it doesn't stand out and just be this giant thing here on the canvas. And we're done! We have a still life from Animal Crossing. If you're interested in this piece, you could buy a poster or a phone case, or bid on this original canvas. There's links down below. Also, consider supporting me on Patreon. You can find out more at supportmal.com. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes of MalMakes, and I'll see you again here for another video game painting.